Hello everyone, this is Vikram and welcome to my channel. In this video, we'll see how to merge multiple kubeconfig files into a single file so that using the single file, we can talk to various Kubernetes clusters running on various cloud environments. We all know that in order to talk to the Kubernetes cluster, we need a utility called kubectl that basically converts the human readable commands into REST API call to the API server of the Kubernetes cluster. And kubectl needs certain configurations such as the cluster endpoint details, server certificate and client keys. And kubeconfig files are such files that provide this information to the kubectl utility. Kubeconfig files are used to organize information about the various clusters, users, namespaces, and any sort of authentication mechanisms that are needed by kubectl to talk to the Kubernetes clusters. By default, kubectl looks for this configuration information in three different locations. The first location is a file called config file under the user's home directory inside .kube directory. So inside this directory, there will be a file called config. So kubectl by default reads this config file if it is existing. And the next location will be kubeconfig environment variable, which basically takes list of all possible paths to these configuration files. Let's say you have various cloud environments that are running Kubernetes clusters, and each Kubernetes cluster will in turn have a kubeconfig file. So you can put all these config files into a location, or else you can append these locations and give it as the environment variable called kubeconfig. So here I have kubeconfig environment variable, which is basically taking all the pre-existing values, colon, and any new path with the kubeconfig files. Let's say I have a kubeconfig file in the user's home directory. So this one I'm just appending it to already existing the existing environment variable. Let's say I have one more kubeconfig file which is under /home/temp. So I can append the path just like this now, and all these configurations will be merged into a single configuration, and then it will be stored as kubeconfig environment variable. So if there is no file, so we can set this kubeconfig environment variable. So third one is giving the kubeconfig file location or exact kubeconfig file in line with your kubectl command. So here I'm using kubectl and some view command, config view command. So here I can supply the configuration inline by using ---- kubeconfig as the command line flag. So I can just give it inline. So this kubectl reads this kubeconfig file and then it will execute commands in the respective cluster. So the entire kubectl configuration file is broken into three different sections. So the first section is the user section, which basically has the user related information. Let's say that I have three different users in the same configuration file. So in that configuration file, I have to put three different credentials for each user. So basically the user will have the client certificate and the client key. And then we have the clusters. So in the same configuration file, I can have multiple clusters information. So each cluster will have its own API server endpoint details and the server certificate. Now, let's say this user has access to both cluster 01 and cluster 02. So instead of manually mapping them individually, let's say that user 1 wants to talk to cluster 1 now. Now, in order to create this kind of a mapping or create an active session so that this particular user talk to this cluster, we have to create a mapping also known as context in case of kubeconfig files. So what does this config will do? Context will do is context will map a user to a particular cluster. So for this mapping, let's say I'm just naming it as map_1. So this is not the actual naming conversion. I'm just assuming map_1 is the context name that maps this user to this cluster. Let's say this user 01 also has access to cluster 02. For this mapping, I'm just naming this mapping as map_2. So now let's say that this user 1 wants to run certain commands always in cluster 01. Now in this case, what I have to do, I have to take this map_1 context and make it as a current context. So for all the consecutive commands by the kubectl utility, these commands will go and run in this cluster. Similarly, for user 03 to talk to the cluster 01, I have to create one more context and I have to name it properly so that if I make map_3 as the current context, user 3 can access the cluster 01. Now if I have to see the configuration file or kubeconfig file, I can directly VI into that file, or else I can use kubectl config u, which basically reads the configuration file in any of the three standard locations, and it will print the config file on the terminal. Now if you look clearly, here the configuration file is nothing but an YAML file, and the API version is v1. And as we discussed, there are three different sections. One is the clusters, the other one is the users, and the third one is the context, which basically is a map between a cluster and a user. Now clusters, as I said, it takes list of clusters. That means it can handle multiple clusters, so that's why we have an array element here. So if you have new cluster, you can add one more array element. Now in this cluster we have the cluster certificate and the API server endpoint details, and for this cluster I'm just naming it as Kubernetes, or else let's say that this is the GCP cluster, I can simply name it as GCP just for identification. Now coming to the users, so here I have a user named as Kubernetes admin, and this is the user certificate and the key. So now in order for this user to talk to this Kubernetes cluster, or let's say if I name it as GCP, if he has to talk to this GCP cluster, I have to create a context. Context is nothing but a mapping. Here the context name I'm setting as this one. So this name is it is up to the user. So it doesn't have to be at the rate and something like this. So you can also put like GCP underscore cluster or something like that. And now the important part is this one. So what is it is mapping? So it is mapping a user called Kubernetes admin, which we can find here, and a cluster by the name Kubernetes, which we can find here. Now user is now talking to this cluster. Now we can also set what is the namespace in which he can run his commands. So we are setting as default. That means whenever a user connects to that cluster, or whenever this current context is active, so user can talk to this cluster only in this namespace. So we don't give every user access to every namespace in the cluster. Depending upon the requirements only we will give. Let's say this Kubernetes admin needs access to only dev cluster. So in this case we create we put namespace as dev, so that he'll get access to only dev namespace. Okay, it is not that he will get only access to the dev namespace, it is that his commands will run in the dev namespace, but actual restrictions has to be put in the role and role bindings, so which we'll discuss later. Now what is the current context? Let's say that you have multiple clusters, 1 2 3 clusters. Let's say that we have multiple users, 4 5 6. Now let's say this sixth user has to talk to third cluster, something like that. Now I have to create a current context. Current context is the active context. So active context, what I'm doing, I'm just giving in a name. So in the list of contexts that I have to give any name, so that will act as the current context. Here I have only one context, so if I have only one context, that is the context name which I am mentioning here. So this is the generalized form. So I have the multiple clusters, I have the multiple users, I can have multiple context. Let's say this is the context I wanted to make it as current, then I have to take this name and put it in the current context details. And in order to let's say that you have a kubeconfig file with various clusters, contexts and users, and you wanted to see only the clusters, I can use kubectl config get clusters. For context, get context, and you wanted to see what is the current context that is active, you can just run kubectl config current context. That will print the name of the context which is currently active. Now you can also set the default namespace. Let's say that when I'm creating a context here, I'm creating a namespace called default, but you can also change it to some dev or any other namespace without actually without actually modifying this particular file, by using some commands like kubectl config set context. That is, I'm changing the current context, and I'm modifying the current context, the context which is currently active, and that context namespace I'm changing it to dev. That means if this is the current context that is active, and this is the context, the default namespace is default, so this one I'm just changing it to dev through commands. Now hyphen current corresponds to the current context. You can also use kubectl config current context to get the current context information and then change that context information namespace to dev, or else there is a shortcut called hyphen hyphen current which basically runs this command internally. Now let's say that you have multiple contexts. So here I have only one context. If I have context like this dev front end, dev storage, and exp scratch, so I can make the third one as active. So basically I can modify this current context manually with the context name of my choice, or else using kubectl config current context, kubectl config use context and the name of the context, I can switch to the other context. So now to see the demo, we are going to create two different clusters, one locally in the minikube cluster and the other one inside the CO cluster, and then we'll download both the kubeconfig files and see how to merge them together. So first let us start the minikube cluster. So let's check whether minikube is already running by just checking minikube status. It is stopped, so I'll just run minikube start and it will take at least 2-3 minutes to start. Now what I'll do is I'll try to create one more cluster in the meanwhile. So we have something known as CO platform, which basically can create Kubernetes clusters in the cloud. So I can just click on the create new Kubernetes cluster over here, and then name I'm just giving it as CO only. Number of instances are 3. Network I'm not doing anything over here. I'm going to select the standard small instances and just go ahead and create a cluster. So even this will take some 2-3 minutes. So meanwhile what we'll do is we'll see the readme file that I have put in the GitHub. So inside my profile there is a repository called YouTube series, and in the Kubernetes directory there is a file called merge kubeconfig files. So this is the overall process to merge two different kubeconfig files. We'll see how to merge them manually. At the same time we'll see how to do it using kubectl commands. So first thing is we'll take the backup of the already existing kubeconfig file so that we don't mess up with the existing configuration file. And then what we'll do is we'll use kubectl config view hyphen hyphen flatten to merge two different configuration files. But where should I give the paths to the two different configuration files? So I have to put kubeconfig equal to any number of paths. So this is the existing path that is created by the minikube cluster, and this is the new configuration file which I'll be downloading from the CO cluster. So both these configurations are separated by colon, so I can have n number of configuration files separated by colon, and then using kubectl config view hyphen hyphen flatten. So this will basically combine 2 or 3, I mean any number of configuration files that we input, and then I am just redirecting it to a single file. So this file, what I'm doing is I am just replacing with the existing one. So this is the existing one that is created by the minikube cluster. So I'll take the merged one and then I'll just replace with the existing one. And then if you want, after testing, you can remove the backup configuration file which we took in the first step. And then in order to see the difference between the earlier configuration file that is having only minikube cluster information and with the merged one with both minikube and CO, so I can use different commands to see different users, clusters, configurations, and all such information. And also what we'll do is we'll also create some test applications to see whether these are getting deployed. Now my minikube cluster is up and running. So if I just do ls on my home directory, so there will be a file called the directory called cube.cube, and inside it we have a file known as config. Yes, so this is the file which is created by the minikube once it has started the cluster. So what I'll do is basically I'll put all these configurations in a single folder called config files in the download directory. And before copying into here, let me take the backup of already existing so that I don't mess up with the existing one. So I'm just taking it as I'm just taking a backup in the same directory. Now what I'll do is I'll just move the original configuration file into current working directory, so which is inside this configuration files. So this is where I'll compare both the configuration files of Minikube and Civo, and then let me open the VS Code in the same directory. So this is the configuration file generated by Minikube. So this is the cluster related information. As you see, there is only one cluster called Minikube cluster, and this is the server endpoint details, and this is the certificate authority CA certificate. So this extension is just a metadata, so I can simply remove this extension. And coming to the users, so there is user related information over here. And coming to the context, so context basically map a user with the cluster. So as you see, this is the user is Minikube, which is given here, and namespace is default. So let me remove this extensions information which is not needed. So user is mapped to a cluster called Minikube, so this is the name of the Minikube cluster, and the namespace set as default. And the current context, so if you see, this is the only context that I have, and I'm just making it as an active, and the kind is config, and API version is v1. So if you want, you can just cut this kind, and then you can also put it here, because this is basically a YAML file, so order doesn't matter here. And now this is the configuration file by Minikube. So let us go to the Civo cluster and then download the Civo clusters kubeconfig file. So this is where you can download the kubeconfig file. So I'll download it and I'll put it in the same directory. So I've just downloaded that file, and you can see the Civo kubeconfig file. So it is also the same thing, API version, kind, and there is a cluster called Civo cluster. There is a user known as Civo, and then there is a context which is basically mapping Civo user with the Civo cluster, and I'm just naming that context as the Civo name. So these are the two different configuration files. So if I want, I can manually combine them together. So how will I do is, so let me open this in the next tab. So this is my earlier configuration, which is the Minikube. So I can modify this because I've already taken the backup. So clusters, I'll take this cluster, cut it or copy it, and then I'll paste it here. So here now I have two clusters information. Similarly, I'll take a user from here and I'll paste it here. So I have user information and context. So there is one context here. I'll just cut it. You can put it anywhere. So order doesn't matter, as I said. Let me cut it again. So Civo. So here, if you see, there are two contexts. So with the name Civo, and the other context is the name Minikube, but the current one is Minikube. So if I have to change it to the Civo, I just have to give the context name Civo here. So here, I've manually merged them together. So, but this is not the usual way. So let's see how to do it programmatically. So I'm just going to delete this Civo. And now let's go back to the Git repository and see how to do it. So basically we have taken the backup, and now in order to merge two different configuration files, so I have to use kubectl config view -- flatten, and I will redirect to a certain file. So I'll just copy this whole command in the VS Code. I'll just open up a terminal and I'll navigate to the same location where the two files are existing. If I do ls, you can see both. Now I'll just paste this command. So where is the first kubeconfig file? Basically it is in the same directory by the path known as config, and the second one is with the a file name called Civo kubectl config view -- flatten. So I'm just redirecting it to a file called new_config. So it is saying config file not found, Civo config. So if I do ls, Okay, this CO new config file is uh, generated. If I open this new, so it is everything is null. So let me close this. If I just check the existing kubeconfig files, everything is there. So let me regenerate it again. So it is okay. So it is the configuration. So let me give the full path / downloads. Under the configuration file, there is a config downloads config files sivo config file. So I'm just giving the full pass just to check, and also I'm going to generate in the same location called downloads config files. Yeah, so now it is generated. So if I open the new config file, so now everything is merged properly. So we don't have to do anything manually. I have just used kubectl command to merge them together. So now this is a new configuration file which I can use to replace the existing one. So where is the existing one? So if I do ls-l, this is the new one. So I'll just use mv to move this new configuration file. Okay, before moving, let us just check the earlier configuration file first. If I do ls on the earlier configuration inside .cube, so there is no such file because we have moved it. So let me just move the backup file as the original file. Let me rename it to same config. So that is the minikube config which we have. Now if I do ls on the .cube directory, so we have the configuration file. Now if I just do kubectl config view, so I'll only get one information like minikube information because I have not yet replaced with the merged configuration. So in order to verify it, if I just use kubectl config get clusters, so there is only one cluster called minikube. Now what I'll do is, here I have a new merged file. I'm going to move that new merged file, and then I'll just replace the existing one. Now it is replaced. If I just do kubectl config view now, here you can see the merged configuration details because we have just replaced. I can also use kubectl config get clusters. So there are three clusters now. Two clusters. I can also do kubectl get users. There are two users. Kubectl contexts, there are two contexts, but basically minikube is the context which is currently active. Now whatever I run, so basically it runs in my local minikube cluster. Now if I have to make sivo as a default cluster, so I can use kubectl config use context, and then sivo is the name, so I can name it as sivo. I can use context sivo. If I use kubectl config get context, so now sivo is marked as currently active. So this is how you connect to a different clusters. Sorry, you can merge various kubeconfig files to connect to various Kubernetes clusters. And by default, if I just use kubectl config view, so here the current context namespace, generally it is the default, but if you want to change it to some other namespace like the dev or something, you can just use this command, which is kubectl config set context current context to some other namespace. So in order to prove it, what I'll do is I'll just switch the use context to minikube, so that in my local cluster I can prove it. My minikube cluster is currently active. So if I just use kubectl get pods, so there are no there is one pod which basically running from before. I'm just going to delete this pod. So this pod is deleted. Now if I have to run a pod, a dummy pod, so I have just given it here, so you can take this command and run a dummy pod. So this pod is created. But basically if you do kubectl get po, so I have this pod information, but this pod is running in the default namespace. But if I have to run it in the dev namespace, what I have to do, I have to use hyphen and dev. So this basically goes and runs everything in the dev namespace. But instead of using hyphen and dev or switching the namespace like that, so I can permanently switch the namespace by using kubectl config set context. Basically I'm just selecting whatever is the current context which is active by using hyphen hyphen current, and using hyphen hyphen namespace as dev, I'm switching the current context namespace from default to dev. Now if I just use kubectl get pod, so you're not going to get anything because I've permanently switched to the dev namespace. In the dev namespace currently there are no pods running. Even if I just use kubectl config view, you can see that information in the kubeconfig file as well. So here this is the current context called minikube. So in the minikube context details, the namespace is changed to dev. So if I just change it back to default and then check the kubectl config view, so the namespace is changed to default. So this is how you work with the kubeconfig files using kubectl utility for switching between various Kubernetes clusters. So every information is given in this readme file, and I'm going to put this in the video description. That's it for this video, guys. If you like our video, consider subscribing to our YouTube channel and joining our Facebook group. The links are given in the description below. You can also scan the QR codes being displayed in this video. And for any training requirements, you can join our Telegram channel where we post regular updates on our upcoming trainings. You can also WhatsApp us on the number being shown here. You can also drop us an email for any kind of training inquiries. Thank you.